Rufus Hale grabbed his wife by the hair and dragged her across the trading post floor like she was a sack of feed he'd decided to throw out. It was the middle of the afternoon. The door was wide open. 3 men stood on the porch, and not one of them moved. "Get up," he said. "You're an embarrassment just lying there." Mabel pressed her palms to the floorboards and tried to push herself upright. Her lip was split. Her left eye had already begun to swell. She didn't make a sound. She'd learned that sounds made things worse. Rufus looked at the men on the porch, grinned at them, and went back behind the counter like nothing had happened. That was a Tuesday. If this story made your blood run hot, you're not alone. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe and follow along because what happens next will shake you to your core, and you do not want to miss a single moment of it. But just the morning Mabel Ashcroft understood that no one was coming to help her, she was 26 years old and standing in the back room of her father's trading post, pressing a damp cloth to her ribs to keep the bruising from spreading too wide before customers arrived. She had married Rufus Hale 14 months before. At the time, it had seemed like something close to good fortune, though even then she hadn't let herself believe it fully. Rufus was lean and smooth-talking and had a smile that he deployed like a tool, easy and practiced, aimed at whoever he needed to soften up. He had come to Delworth 3 years after Mabel's father died and left her the post and the ranch attached to it. 1,200 acres of decent grazing land, a sound well, a barn that didn't leak, and a small house that had always been kept clean. Rufus spent 4 months being kind to her before he proposed. She should have known. She told herself later that she should have known. But she was alone in a way that wore on a person steadily, like water over stone, and Rufus had been the first man in recent memory who looked at her without his face doing something careful and polite while his eyes slid away. Or so she'd believed. Looking back, she couldn't say whether he'd actually been good at it or whether she'd just been desperate enough to see what she wanted. Either way, she said yes. The wedding was small. The preacher's wife brought a cake. One of the ranch hands played fiddle on the porch. Rufus kissed her cheek and put his hand at her waist and smiled for the 12 people assembled. And Mabel had stood there in the dress she'd sewn herself and thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what comes next. The smile lasted 11 days. She remembered the first time clearly, the way people remember things that rearrange them permanently. She had burnt the biscuits. That was all. She had burnt the biscuits because she'd stepped outside to check on a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, and when she came back in, the kitchen was full of smoke. Rufus had been sitting at the table. He stood up, looked at the pan, and hit her across the mouth with the back of his hand. No warning, no building up to it, just the flat, efficient fact of it. He didn't apologize afterward. He sat back down and waited for her to make something else. She made something else. In the months that followed, she spent a great deal of time trying to map it, to figure out what set him off so she could avoid it. That was how she framed it to herself early on: management, avoidance. If she could just stay 2 steps ahead of his mood, she could keep things from getting bad. She kept the house cleaner. She cooked better. She stopped talking at meals unless he spoke to her first. She stopped going into town alone because once a man had tipped his hat to her on the road, and Rufus had found out and put her arm through the cabinet door to make his feelings on the subject plain. None of it worked because there was no map. The map didn't exist. The hitting didn't follow rules. It followed moods, and his moods were tidal. She could feel them coming sometimes, a pressure in the air around him, something that made the hair on her arms stand up the way they did before lightning. But she could never predict it precisely enough to be safe. What she learned instead was how to minimize damage, how to fall without landing on her wrist wrong, how to cover the marks that showed, how long to stay out of the room after it happened. She also learned something she hadn't expected, that people would help him hide it. Sheriff Harlan Dodd had come to the post twice in those first 14 months. Once because a neighbor had heard shouting from a half-mile off. Once because one of the ranch hands had gone into town looking shaken, and somebody at the saloon had asked too many questions. Both times, Harlan Dodd had stood in the front room of the trading post, hat in hand, and listened to Rufus explain that his wife had fallen or tripped or had a nervous condition that made her clumsy. Both times, Harlan Dodd had looked at Mabel for exactly as long as was polite and then had looked away. The second time, Mabel had met his eyes and held them, not saying anything, just holding his gaze long enough that he would have had to be a blind man not to understand what she was telling him without words. He cleared his throat and looked at Rufus. "You all take care now," he said, and he left. That was when she stopped expecting rescue. She started keeping the books instead. It gave her something to do with her mind in the hours when the fear settled low and heavy like weather. And it turned out she was good at it. Better than good, actually, in a way that surprised her because no one had ever suggested she might be smart at anything. Her father had taught her figures when she was small, sitting at this same counter, and the skill had stayed with her, layered over but not gone. She worked the accounts in the mornings before Rufus came down, and she ran the post through the afternoons, and she kept the ranch ledger balanced to the penny. She paid the hands their wages herself and ordered the supplies and negotiated the prices with the suppliers who came through on the supply road twice a month. Rufus let her do all of this because he didn't want to do it himself. He wanted the ownership. He wanted the land under his name and the post at his back and the sense that he had acquired something substantial. But the actual labor of maintaining a business, the careful, unglamorous daily work of keeping everything functional, bored him. So he drank at the saloon and played cards and made friends of the kind of men who respected size and volume over substance. And he left the operation of his wife's inheritance entirely to his wife. Mabel kept the books. She kept the post running. She kept the ranch from falling apart. And she took the beatings when they came and covered the bruises and did not cry in front of him because crying made things worse. That was her life for 3 years. By the time the summer of 1884 came around, she had stopped thinking much about what her life might have been. She thought about inventory and weather, and whether the east fence needed restringing before the fall drove the cattle toward the tree line. She thought about the accounts. She thought about the bruise on her left side that hadn't healed right and might be a cracked rib, though she hadn't gone to see Doc Morrow because Doc Morrow and Rufus drank together on Thursdays. She did not think about happiness. Happiness had become a word that belonged to other people. The day everything changed was an ordinary day. There was nothing in the morning to suggest it. She had opened the post at 7, stocked the front shelves, swept the floor, and served 4 customers before noon. A farmer's wife buying flour and salt, 2 hands from the Beckett spread picking up tobacco, and old Clement Price who came in every week to look at the same 3 things and buy none of them. Rufus was at the saloon. He'd gone at 10 in the morning, which meant he'd come back ugly around 3. She was behind the counter tallying a supply order when she heard the door. She didn't look up right away. She had a habit of finishing her number before she raised her eyes because interrupting herself mid-figure always meant having to start the column over. "Be right with you," she said. She finished the column. She looked up. The man in the doorway was taller than most, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any particular intention. Broad through the chest, long in the arm, carrying a week's worth of trail dust on a coat that had been good once. He had a hat pushed back on his head, and he was looking at her with a directness that wasn't rude, just present, alert, like a man who paid attention to things around him, not because he was suspicious, but because it was simply his way. She watched him take in the room, the counter, the shelves, her. His eyes stopped on her face for a moment. Just a moment. Then they moved to the bruising along her jaw. They stopped there. Mabel set down her pencil. She kept her voice even. "Looking for anything in particular?" He stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. "Some salt pork if you have it," he said. "And coffee if it's good." "I have both." She moved down the counter. "Coffee's from this morning, but I can put fresh on." "Morning's fine." He came to the counter and set his hat on it. He was looking at the jar of licorice sticks near the window with the particular blankness of a man thinking about something else entirely. "Long ride," he said. "Through the canyon or the South Road?" "Canyon." A pause. "Didn't know there was a South Road." "Shorter, but the grade's worse on a horse. Takes longer than it looks on a map." She filled a tin cup and set it on the counter. "You passing through?" He picked up the coffee, took a sip, didn't answer right away. "Not sure yet," he said. That was how it started, nothing dramatic about it. A man walked in off the trail and bought salt pork and drank mediocre coffee and said 5 words that added up to the possibility that he might stay a while. His name was Gideon Cross. He told her when he paid. Not because she asked, but because he offered it in the straightforward way of someone who considered his name a reasonable thing for a person to know. Mabel Ashcroft, she said. Something moved across his face. It wasn't pity. She'd seen pity. The slight softening around the eyes, the careful tone. This wasn't that. It was something more like recognition, like a man who had seen a thing before and was noting it quietly, not for show. He left without saying more. She watched him through the window cross the street to the livery, and then she went back to her supply order and tried to put him out of her head. She could not put him out of her head. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never stayed long, and he never bought much. A length of rope one day, a tin of boot grease the next, once a week's worth of dried beans that she packaged for him without comment. He didn't try to make conversation for the sake of it. He asked about trail conditions to the north. He mentioned that the well behind the livery was running low, and she should tell whoever owned the livery to dig it deeper before September. He noticed things and mentioned them plainly, and there was something in that, in being spoken to plainly, that Mabel felt in her chest like a window opening after a long winter. Rufus noticed him on the third day. She had known it was coming. Delworth was small, and Rufus paid attention to who came into his wife's post, particularly men. He had come in just before closing while Gideon was at the counter, and Mabel had watched the particular shift in Rufus's posture, the shoulders pulling back, the chin lifting just slightly, that performance of size and authority that he ran whenever he felt the need to establish something. "Don't believe I've seen you in Delworth before," Rufus said. Not unfriendly yet, just territorial. Gideon looked at him. "Rode in 3 days ago," he said. "Drifter?" "I move around." Rufus smiled. It was the smile without warmth. "Lots of men move around out here, some of them with reason and some of them without." He came to stand beside Mabel behind the counter, say, his post, his wife, his property, all of it, one thing in his mind. "This is my wife's store." "I know," Gideon said. He looked at Mabel for a moment. "She runs it well." The words were quiet. They didn't seem aimed at anything, but Rufus went very still. "She does all right," Rufus said. "Better than all right," Gideon said. "Best stocked post I've seen in 200 miles. He picked up his package of dried goods and nodded at Mabel. "Same time tomorrow?" It was a nothing question, just asking if she'd be open. But the way Rufus's jaw moved told Mabel that he had heard it differently. "Every day but Sunday," she said. Her voice was steady. Gideon left. Rufus waited until the door was fully shut, then turned to her with the particular expression that she'd learned to read like weather. "Who is he?" "A customer." "Don't be smart with me." "I'm not being smart. He's a customer. He buys things and pays for them and leaves. That's what customers do." Rufus leaned toward her across the counter. "He looks at you." Mabel kept her eyes on the ledger. "He looks at the shelves. He's deciding what he needs." "He looks at your face." She said nothing. "Is there something on your face that needs looking at?" His voice had gone quiet in the way it did, and her pulse went up even though she kept her face still. Quiet Rufus was more dangerous than loud Rufus. Loud Rufus was performance. Quiet Rufus was decision. "I don't know what he looks at," she said carefully. "I'm not looking back." It was close enough to true that it didn't sound like a lie, and it gave him nothing to grab onto because the alternative, telling him, "Yes, actually, the stranger looks at my bruises, and that's what you're afraid of," would have cost her more than she wanted to pay that evening. Rufus straightened up. He put his hand on the side of her face, a gesture that from outside might have looked like affection, and pressed his thumb slightly into the bruise along her jaw until she held her breath against making a sound. "Close up early tonight," he said. She closed up early. That night she lay in the dark and listened to Rufus snoring across the room and thought about what Gideon Cross had said. She runs it well. Better than all right. Not spoken to her as a husband speaks to a wife, with ownership built into every word. Spoken to Rufus about her like she was a person in her own right, separate and distinct, with qualities that could be measured and noted and stated plainly. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken about her that way. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the bed. The wall was solid. The house was solid. Her father had built it to last, had built all of it to last. The post, the barn, the fences, the well. She had kept it going. 3 years of keeping it going, through everything, and it was still here because she was still here. She didn't sleep much that night. The following week moved in a pattern she had not expected. Gideon came to the store each morning and purchased something small and asked questions about the territory that were genuine questions, not pretexts. He asked about the cattle market and the grade of the land to the north and whether the creek had run low the previous summer. He talked to her like a person who happened to be useful to him in practical ways. And that usefulness, the fact of it, the plainness of it, was more steadying than anything soft would have been. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a person who doesn't volunteer information. In pieces, over time, without any particular drama. He was from Colorado originally. He had worked cattle and then briefly as a deputy in a mining town 2 territories over, though he didn't say why he'd stopped. He had a horse named after no one, just called Brown, that he kept in the livery and checked on every evening. He had a sister who had died. He told her about the sister on a Thursday, 10 days after he'd first walked through the door. She had mentioned, without thinking, that a woman 3 farms over had been taken in by her brother after her husband had put her in the hospital, and there was a moment before she caught herself where something in her voice had shifted, some color of feeling she hadn't meant to let out. Gideon had been quiet for a moment. "I had a sister," he said. Mabel looked up. "She married a man something like your neighbor's husband." He kept his eyes on the window. "I was 2 days' ride away. By the time somebody sent word, it was too late." The silence stretched. Outside, someone was crossing the street on horseback at a slow walk. "I'm sorry," Mabel said. "I don't talk about it much." His jaw was set, not with emotion that wanted to spill, but with the kind of feeling that had been held so long it had compressed into something almost like stone. I don't walk past certain things anymore. That's all." Mabel put down the pencil she'd been holding. "Is that why you're still here?" He looked at her then. Directly, the way he had that first day. "Partly," he said. She didn't ask what the other part was. She wasn't ready to hear the answer, and she could tell from the way he looked back out the window that he wasn't sure he was ready to give it. That afternoon, Rufus came in an hour earlier than usual and drunk in a way that meant something had happened at the saloon. She recognized the particular unsteadiness, not the sloppy kind, but the kind that made him careful, deliberate, like a man saving up for something. Gideon had just been about to leave with the tin of boot grease he'd bought and then lingered over for 20 minutes on some transparent pretext. He was at the door when Rufus came through it, and they had to sidestep each other, and the contact was brief and unavoidable, and Rufus took it personally in the way he took everything personally. "Watch yourself," Rufus said, not looking at Gideon, looking at Mabel. Gideon stopped. He turned back. He looked at Rufus with the same direct, unhurried attention he gave everything, and there was something in it that was very still and very specific. "You talking to me?" he said. "I'm talking to whoever's listening," Rufus said. "Then I'm listening." Gideon stepped back inside. He was a full head shorter than Rufus and didn't seem to notice. "Is there something you want to say plainly?" Rufus looked at him. Mabel could see Rufus calculating. The other man's build, the way he held himself. Rufus was not a coward in the ordinary sense. He was the kind of man who enjoyed violence when the odds were clearly in his favor, and the calculation happening now was whether they were. "My wife doesn't need a customer who comes in every day," Rufus said. "It's not neighborly." "I pay full price," Gideon said, "and I come in the morning when the posts open. That's generally how stores work." "Smart man," Rufus said, not a compliment. "I try to be." Gideon looked over at Mabel. She was gripping the edge of the counter without meaning to. He looked back at Rufus. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Same as always." Rufus didn't move from the doorway. Gideon waited. Mabel held her breath. After a long moment, Rufus stepped aside. Gideon walked past him, unhurried, and the door swung shut. Rufus stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then he turned toward Mabel. "Shut the post," he said. "It's not yet 3. Shut it." She moved out from behind the counter and walked to the door and flipped the sign and pulled the shutters closed. Her hands were shaking. She kept them close to her side so he wouldn't see. What came next was bad. Not the worst. There was always a worst. A specific memory she kept in a box she didn't open, but bad enough that she lay on the storeroom floor afterward and breathed very deliberately, in through the nose, out through the mouth, taking inventory of what needed attention. The ribs she'd been worried about were definitely not right. Her shoulder had hit the shelving unit when she went down, and she'd have to move carefully tomorrow. She lay there until she was sure Rufus had left for the saloon. Then she got up, she cleaned herself up, she made a cold cloth for her face. She sat at the counter in the dark and opened the ledger. The numbers were the same as they'd been this morning. They didn't care about anything except whether they added up. She found that steadying. She was 3/4 through the column when she heard a sound near the back door. Quiet, deliberate. She went still. A knock. 2 beats, evenly spaced. She didn't move. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Gideon's voice, low. "I saw him leave. I wanted to make sure you could hear me walking around before I walked around." She sat there for a moment. Then she got up and went to the back door and opened it. He was standing on the step. He had the tin of boot grease still in his hand, as if he'd forgotten he was carrying it. His eyes went to her face and stayed there, doing that thing they did. Not flinching away, not shifting to something more comfortable, just taking in what was there with a steadiness that she found both harder and easier to bear than looking away. "You have any kind of lock on this back door, say?" he asked. She shook her head. He looked at the door frame. "I can fix that," he said. It was such a small thing, such a completely specific and practical and small thing to say, and it broke something open in her chest that she had kept sealed for a long time. She pressed her lips together, kept her chin up. "Okay," she said. She let him in. He looked at the door frame and looked at the hinges and said he'd bring what he needed in the morning. He didn't touch her, and he didn't make her feel like something that needed to be managed. He sat down in the chair across the room and said, in a completely level voice, that he was going to be honest with her about something if she was willing to hear it. She sat down at the counter. "I've been watching your husband for a week and a half," he said. "I've seen the way he comes in here. I saw him from across the street this afternoon. I know what I'm looking at." He looked at the tin in his hands, put it down on the table. "I'm not going to pretend I don't." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Nobody else does," she said. "Pretend, I mean. They just actually don't see it, or they decide not to." "I know. Including the sheriff." "I figured." She looked at her hands. "So what does that mean? You've been watching. Now you've seen it up close. Tomorrow morning, you'll pack up your horse and go 2 territories over, and none of this will be your problem." Gideon was quiet. "I could do that," he said. He said it honestly, without drama. "That's a real option. I've done it before and I've regretted it every day since." He looked at her. "I'm not going to do it again." The silence in the room was different from the silence of before, harder to explain, less like absence and more like a thing that was itself. "You don't owe me anything," Mabel said. "No," he said. "I don't." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. "But I'm still going to be here tomorrow, and the day after." He stood up. "You should sleep if you can. Is there somewhere he won't—" "I'll be fine," she said. He looked at her. He didn't argue. He didn't push. "Good night, Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Mabel," she said. She didn't know why she said it exactly. It just seemed right. "Good night, Mabel," he said. He went out the back door and she heard his boots on the dry ground, even and unhurried, fading into the dark. She sat at the counter for a long while after. She didn't know what was coming. She wasn't foolish enough to think that one man with a conscience could untangle 3 years of damage in a week. She wasn't the kind of woman who believed in sudden rescues, because she had spent 3 years discovering that no rescue was coming, and the believing had left her slow and painful, like ice melting. But something had shifted tonight in some small and irreversible way. Not fixed, not better, not yet. Just shifted. She picked up the pencil and found her place in the ledger and finished the column. The numbers added up. She wrote the total at the bottom. Put the ledger away. Turned off the lamp. Outside, Delworth settled into its nighttime sounds. The distant noise from the saloon, a dog somewhere down the south road, the creak of the water trough in the wind. She lay down on the storeroom cot she'd started using 2 months ago, when sleeping in the bedroom had begun to feel like a trap she walked into every night. She thought about the door lock. Such a specific, practical, small thing. She closed her eyes. He came back the next morning with a lock. Not a fancy one, just a solid iron bolt, the kind you'd find on a barn door, with a bracket on each side and 4 screws that meant business. He set it on the counter without ceremony, the way he did everything, and looked at her face to see what the night had left behind. She had done what she could with cold water and time. The swelling along her cheekbone had gone down some. The cut at the corner of her mouth had closed. She'd pinned her hair differently to cover the place near her ear that was still tender. He looked at all of it and said nothing about any of it. He picked up the bolt and went to the back door. "You have a screwdriver?" he asked. "Top shelf, right side, behind the nails." He found it. She listened to him work while she opened the post and turned the sign and swept the front step. The screwdriver against the old wood made a steady, purposeful sound. It was a good sound. She swept longer than the step needed. When she came back in, he was testing the bolt, sliding it across, back, across again. It caught cleanly each time. "That'll hold," he said. She looked at it. Simple iron, a bracket on the door, and a bracket on the frame, and a bolt that slid between them. Something that cost less than $1 and maybe 40 minutes of work, and would have changed the last 3 years in ways she couldn't let herself calculate without getting very still and very quiet somewhere behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said. He put the screwdriver back on the shelf. "Anything else need fixing while I'm here?" She almost said no out of habit. She caught herself. "The front window latch has been sticking, left side." He looked at it. "I can fix that." He did. She served 2 customers while he worked on the latch, and the normalcy of it, a man fixing a window while she sold flour and tobacco, felt strange and clean and slightly dangerous, the way things felt when you'd been without them long enough that their return was almost too much to hold. Rufus came in at 11. He stopped just inside the door and looked at Gideon with the window latch, and then at Mabel behind the counter, and then back at Gideon. His face did the calculation it always did. "What are you doing in here?" he said. Gideon turned from the window. "Window latch was sticking. Your wife mentioned it yesterday." "I didn't hire you." "No." Gideon tested the latch. It caught cleanly. He turned fully to face Rufus. "But it needed doing, and I was here. That's generally how things get done." Rufus's eyes went to Mabel. She was standing very still. "Get out," Rufus said. Gideon picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter. He didn't move fast. He didn't move slow. He walked to the door at a pace that said he was leaving because he'd decided to leave, not because Rufus had told him to, and there was a difference between those 2 things that was legible in every step. He stopped in the doorway. He looked back at Mabel, not at Rufus. "Same time tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes. "The post opens at 7, she said. He left. Rufus didn't hit her that morning. He stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, and then he went out the way he came in, and she heard him cross the street toward the saloon, his boot heels hitting the boards with the particular rhythm that meant he was working something over in his head. She waited until she could no longer hear him. Then she let out a slow breath. She went back to the counter. She picked up the pencil. She put it down again. She walked to the back door and slid the new bolt across. It caught. She stood there with her hand on it for a moment, feeling the cool iron under her palm. Then she went back to work. The days that followed settled into a pattern she hadn't expected to feel like anything, and felt like everything. Gideon came in the mornings and stayed an hour, sometimes 2. He didn't manufacture reasons anymore. He brought things to fix: the hinge on the grain storage door, a loose board in the front step, the latch on the pen where she kept the 2 chickens she'd been raising behind the post. He worked quietly while she opened and ran the store, and they talked the way people talk when they're doing other things, in pieces, without pressure, about what was immediately in front of them, and sometimes about things further back. She told him about her father on a Wednesday. Not all of it, not the whole shape of the grief, but pieces. That he had built the post himself, that he had taught her figures before she could reach the top shelf, that he had called her Mabel Girl until the day he died, and she had hated it at the time and missed it every day since. Gideon listened without filling in the silences. She'd noticed that about him early on, that he didn't feel the need to fill silences. Most people did. They'd get uncomfortable with the pause and start talking to cover it. And what they said in those moments was almost never what they meant. Gideon just let things sit until there was something worth saying. "He sounds like someone who paid attention," Gideon said eventually. He did. She restacked the tin goods she'd been pretending to organize. "He paid attention to everything except whether I was happy. Not because he didn't care. I think he just assumed that I was managing, that managing was the same as happy." Gideon was quiet. "I did the same thing," he said, "about his sister." He didn't say it directly. He didn't say about his sister. But she heard it. She didn't push. She never pushed with him because pushing wasn't the right tool for a man like Gideon Cross. You waited, and he'd come to things in his own time, and what he said when he got there was worth the wait. She was learning that about him the way she was learning a lot of things about him. The way he took his coffee. No sugar, and he drank it while it was still too hot, as if he'd burned his tolerance for temperature somewhere along the way. The way he held his tools, easy and habitual. The grip of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life without thinking of it as labor. The way he looked at her bruises on the days she came in with new ones. Not with pity, but with a specific kind of anger that he kept contained, very tightly, because he understood that breaking it loose wouldn't help her. She appreciated that more than she could say. She had enough anger of her own. What she needed from the people around her was not more of it, but something steadier. Rufus was getting worse. She had expected that. She was not surprised. A man like Rufus Hale didn't watch another man show up in his wife's store every morning and fix her window latches and drink her coffee and talk to her like a person without the pressure inside him building towards something. His pride was his center of gravity. Anything that threatened it reorganized his entire world. He hadn't hit her badly in the 2 weeks since the bolt went on the door. He'd shoved her twice, grabbed her once hard enough to leave the print of his fingers on her upper arm for 4 days. He was holding back, which was, in its own way, more frightening than the usual pattern, because a man like Rufus didn't hold back because he decided not to hurt her. He held back because he was waiting for the right moment. She knew this. She tracked it the way she tracked weather. What she didn't know and couldn't have predicted was that Rufus had gone to see Harlan Dodd. She found out the way she found out most things in Delworth. Not because anyone told her directly, but because the town had a membrane, thin and permeable, and information moved through it in ways that couldn't always be traced to a source. Clement Price mentioned, without apparent awareness of what he was mentioning, that Rufus and Harlan had been drinking together at the saloon, not at the usual back table, but in the back room, the one with the door. The farmer's wife, who came in Thursdays, said her husband had heard Rufus telling someone outside the hardware store that the drifter at the livery was a man with a history, that he'd heard some things. Mabel wrote both of these things in the back of the ledger in a column she labeled M for miscellaneous. She had begun keeping another set of records, not the accounts. Those were fine. This was something different, dates, times, what happened, and where. She wrote it carefully, in the small, tight hand she used when she wanted to fit a lot of information into a small space, and she kept it in a different book from the accounts, one that looked from the outside like a supplier's catalog she'd stopped using. She didn't know exactly what she intended to do with it. She just knew that documentation was a form of power, and power was in short supply, and she was going to gather whatever she could of it. On a Friday, 2.5 weeks after the bolt went on the door, Gideon came in later than usual. She noticed it before she saw his face, a change in the texture of the morning, something slightly off. He came through the door at 8:30 instead of 7, and when she looked up, his jaw was set differently than usual. "You're late," she said. Matter of fact. "Had a visitor," he said. He came to the counter. He was looking at the jar of licorice sticks again. That absent thinking look. "Harlan Dodd came to the livery this morning." She went still. "What did he want?" "To tell me some things about myself." Gideon put his hat on the counter. "Apparently I'm a man with a violent past and a warrant outstanding somewhere I've never been. Also, I'm known for causing trouble in towns that were peaceful before I arrived." She watched his face. "None of that's true." "No." He picked up the hat, set it back down. "None of it's true. But Harlan seemed very certain it was. Specific certain, if you know what I mean. Like a man who'd been given the words to say. She knew exactly what he meant. He told me to be gone by Sunday, Gideon said. Are you going? He looked at her. I already told you I wasn't doing that again. Harlan Dodd is the law in Delworth, such as it is. I know what he is. She put her hands flat on the counter. Her voice was low and careful. Gideon, I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. He looked at her. He waited. Rufus has been in Delworth for 4 years. He came here because my father had built something worth having and because I was someone he thought he could manage. He has spent 4 years building himself into this town. Not deep, not the way a real man builds a life, but wide. He drinks with Harlan Dodd, and he loans money to 2 of the men on the town council, and he has dinner with the judge on the first Tuesday of every month. He has made himself very hard to go around in this town. She kept her eyes on his. He has also hurt me in ways that are documented because I have been writing it down. But the documentation is in my house where he could find it, and Harlan Dodd would not take my word against Rufus's even if I came in bleeding. Gideon's jaw worked, not with visible emotion, with the effort of keeping it contained. I'm telling you this, she said, not so that you'll leave. I'm telling you because I need you to understand what you're standing in the middle of. And I need you to make a decision with the whole of it in front of you, not just the piece you can see from the livery. He was quiet for a while. The documentation, he said. Is it safe where it is? Not entirely. Can you move it? She thought, I could keep it here, in the post. There's a space under the floorboard in the back room. My father built it for cash during bad years. Rufus doesn't know about it. Then move it today, he said, when he's at the saloon. She nodded. And I need you to tell me something else, he said. His voice had gone to the particular quiet of someone asking a question they've been sitting on. Has it been getting worse since I showed up? She considered lying. It would have been easy and kind. But easy and kind was not what either of them needed, and she had been choosing easy and kind for 3 years, and it had not served her. Some, she said. He's holding it back right now, which means he's building towards something. That's how he works. Gideon picked up his hat. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on his head. A decision in the gesture. Then we're not going to wait for him to decide when, he said. She didn't ask him what that meant. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear the specifics, and she trusted, and this was a new and fragile thing, this trusting, that he would not do something reckless. He was not a reckless man. Everything she had seen of him said he was exactly the opposite. A man who moved slowly and thought through things, and then acted from a position of as much certainty as the situation allowed. He left. She moved the documentation book that afternoon during the 2 hours Rufus spent at the saloon. She slid the floorboard up in the back room and set the book in next to the small tin of emergency cash she still kept there out of old habit, and slid the board back down and moved the storage crate back on top of it. Then she went back to the counter and served the afternoon customers and wrote up the supply order for the following week. The following Wednesday, Gideon came in and told her he'd found something. She was restocking the upper shelves on the far wall and nearly came off the step stool. She caught herself and came down carefully and looked at him. Found what? She said. Records. He came to the counter. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and set it on the counter and smoothed it flat. It was a letter, handwritten, on paper that had been folded and carried a long time. Before I was in Delworth, I was in Marston Creek, 2 territories east. Your husband was there before he came here. She looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. His name was Aldous then, Gideon said. Or that's what he used. Different name, same man. I confirmed it with the description. He married a woman there, a widow with a mill and 40 acres. Mabel's chest went tight. What happened to her? She said. She's alive. He said it quickly, and she felt something release. She's alive, but the mill is gone. He moved money around in ways that are hard to trace after the fact, but a man I know in Marston Creek, a former deputy, someone who owes me a favor, he's been looking at the paperwork. The deed transfer happened 6 months after the wedding. Looked legal. Wasn't. She stared at the letter. He's done this before, she said. Not a question. You're the second that I know of. Could be more. She put her hands flat on the counter. The surface was solid under her palms, and she needed that. Needed something solid to push against while the room rearranged itself around her. She had known, in some general way, that Rufus was the kind of man who had practiced being Rufus. You didn't get that good at it without practice. But knowing it in an abstract way and having it laid out in a handwritten letter in front of you were two different things. The deed to the ranch, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He tried to have me sign something 2 months after we married. I told him the lawyer needed to do it. Gideon looked at her. Did you see a lawyer? I went to see Merritt Foss in Calverton. He's 40 miles east, but he's not in Rufus's pocket. She reached under the counter and found the key ring she kept on a hook. She selected a small key and held it up. There's a lockbox at Foss's office. The deed is there. The original, with my father's signature. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Has Rufus ever asked you about it again? He asks about it regularly. I tell him it's in Calverton with the lawyer and that the lawyer has instructions not to transfer it without my signature in person, witnessed by 2 individuals of standing. He looked at her with something that was maybe the closest he came to surprise. You set that up yourself. I set it up the month after I got married, she said, when I understood what I'd married. He was quiet for another moment. Mabel, he said. Don't say it, she said. I was going to say you're not what I expected. She looked at him. What did you expect? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Someone who'd given up more than you have, he said. She put the keyring back on the hook. She turned back to the upper shelf she'd been restocking because she needed something to do with her hands. I stopped expecting rescue, she said, but I didn't stop working. She passed him a tin of peaches from the crate at her feet without looking. Put that on the second shelf, left side. The label faces out. He put it where she told him. They restocked the shelf together for a few minutes without talking. What happens next, she said. Not a question exactly, but not one. The man in Marston Creek is putting together a formal account of what happened with the mill woman. If it's enough, and he thinks it might be, there's a federal circuit judge who comes through Calverton every 6 weeks. He set another tin on the shelf. The next circuit date is in 5 weeks. 5 weeks. She ran the calculation automatically, the way she ran figures, not hoping, just counting. 5 weeks was 35 days. 35 days of Rufus holding back and building toward something, with Harlan Dodd in his pocket and a circuit judge in Calverton who didn't know any of them existed. 5 weeks is a long time, she said. I know. He's going to do something before then. I can feel it. I know that too. She handed him the last tin without looking. So what do we do for 5 weeks? He set it on the shelf. He turned toward her. He was close enough that she was aware of it. Not uncomfortable, just aware. The particular awareness of being near someone who made you feel less alone rather than more watched. You keep the documentation, he said. Every day. Everything. I keep gathering what I can from outside. And we don't give him a reason to move faster than he wants to. You mean you stop coming every morning? No. He said it flat. I don't mean that at all. I stopped giving him things to use. There's a difference. He looked at the shelf, then at her. I should stop fixing things here. It gives him a story. She thought about it. He was right. She hated that he was right. Come in for supplies, she said. Come in as a customer, nothing else. That's what I was thinking. It was a reasonable plan. It was the sensible, practical, measured response to the situation, and she knew it. And she also knew that what it would look like from inside the post was less. Less of the morning sounds of someone working nearby. Less of the coffee she started making at 6:50 now instead of 7 because she knew he'd be there. Less of the particular kind of company that reminded her she was a person with qualities and not just a problem to be managed. She turned back to the shelf. All right, she said. He came in the next morning and bought a paper bag of dried apricots and a spool of heavy thread and stayed 12 minutes. She gave him his change and he left, and she went back to the accounts. It worked. For 1 week, it worked. Rufus came in twice and found nothing to object to and seemed to settle, slightly, into a watchfulness that was at least not acceleration. He went to the saloon. He came home. He ate what she cooked. He didn't touch her. On the 8th day of that week, a man rode into Delworth that she didn't recognize. He came into the post that afternoon. Thin man, not tall, with a hat pulled low and the weathered look of someone who traveled for a living. He bought tobacco. He looked at the shelves with the specific attention of someone who wasn't really looking at the shelves. He looked at her. "You Mabel Ashcroft?" he said. She kept her expression still. "I am. Heard there's a man staying at the livery here." He tucked the tobacco into his coat. "Goes by Gideon Cross." She looked at him. "I don't keep track of who stays at the livery." The thin man smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Of course not." He put some coins on the counter. "Just curious, a man like that turns up in a lot of places." He left. She stood at the counter and watched him cross the street and stop outside the saloon. He didn't go in. He stood there for a moment and then went around the side toward the alley. She went to the back room. She stood over the loose floorboard for a moment, then got down on her knees and pulled it up. The documentation book was there, and the cash tin, and they were fine. She slid the board back. She stood up. She went to the front window and looked out. The thin man was gone. Down the street outside the livery, she could see Gideon's horse Brown tied to the rail in the afternoon sun. She went back to the counter. She wrote the date and time and description of the thin man in the documentation book in her small, tight handwriting and put it back under the floorboard. Then she turned the page in the accounts ledger and went back to work. She was still working 2 hours later when Gideon came through the door. He saw her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the thin man. She told him precisely and without drama, the way she told him everything. The hat, the question, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the way he'd gone around the side of the saloon instead of in through the front. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Name's probably Chet Varley," he said. He said it the way you say a name you've been hoping not to say. "He does work for people who need things done quietly. Harlan Dodd's the law here, but Rufus wants someone outside the law to watch the situation." "Watch you, you mean?" "Primarily." He put his hands on the counter. His voice stayed level, but she could feel the weight under it. "If Rufus has brought Varley in, the timeline is shorter than 5 weeks. She had known this was coming. She had felt it building the way she felt everything build, that low atmospheric pressure, that change in the quality of the air. "How much shorter?" she said. He looked at her directly. He didn't soften it. "I don't know. But I think we need to move up what we're doing. The circuit judge isn't for 5 more weeks. I know. I'm going to send a letter to Calverton tonight, and I need you to do something." "What?" "I need you to write out everything you know about the deed, about the Marston Creek woman, about Harlan Dodd's involvement, everything. And I need you to send it to Merritt Foss in Calverton by tomorrow's mail rider. Don't send it from here. Ride out to the Henderson farm and give it to their boy to take to the mail stop at Ryder's Crossing." She looked at him. "You think Rufus is watching the outgoing mail? I think Chet Varley will be watching everything that moves in and out of this post by morning." She held that thought for a moment. "All right," she said. "I'll write it tonight." He nodded. She looked at him. Something had changed in the last 10 minutes, not in the room, but in her, a settling, a weight dropping into place, not the weight of defeat, but of decision, the feeling of a person who has finished the part of a situation where waiting was the right response and has arrived at the part where something else is required. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever's coming." She stopped. She started again. "I need you to know that I'm not sitting this out. Whatever moves you make, I'm not just the thing being protected. I'm part of this." He held her eyes. No argument in his face, no reassurance either. Not the false kind. Not the kind that said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Just a plain, considered acknowledgement. "I know that," he said. "I've known that since the first time you ran the numbers at me instead of flinching." She almost smiled. Not quite. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Earlier," he said. 6:30. He left. She watched him cross to the livery. She watched Brown lift his head at the sound of Gideon's boots and flick an ear in recognition. She went to the back room. She found the notebook she used for the longer letters, the good paper her father had kept for important correspondence. She sat at the small table. She picked up the pencil. She started to write. She wrote for 3 hours that night. Not fast. She wasn't a fast writer, and this wasn't the kind of thing you rushed. She wrote the way she kept the accounts, methodically, in order, with dates attached to everything she could date and careful qualifications around everything she couldn't. She wrote about the first time Rufus hit her, 11 days after the wedding. She wrote about the 2 visits from Harlan Dodd and what he had said and what he had not said. She wrote about the deed and the conversation with Merritt Foss in Calverton and the precise language of the instructions she had left with him about transfers. She wrote about the money Rufus had moved from the ranch account to a bank in a town she'd had to look up on a map, the withdrawal she had documented in the back of the ledger without telling him she'd noticed. She wrote about the woman in Marston Creek, what Gideon had told her, as much detail as she had. She wrote about Chet Varley and what he had said and what his face had done while he said it. When she was done, she had 6 pages in her small, tight handwriting. She folded them and put them inside the catalog she used for ordering dry goods, tucked flat against the back cover so they wouldn't shift, and she put the catalog in her market basket under a cloth. Then she went to bed. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to Rufus on the other side of the wall. He'd been drinking when he came in, the heavy, deliberate kind of drunk, and he'd gone to bed without speaking to her, which meant he was either past caring or saving it. She tracked his breathing until it evened out. Then she stared at the ceiling. 5 weeks had become something shorter. She didn't know how much shorter. She knew the feeling of a situation that was about to move faster than anyone had planned for, and this was that feeling, low and certain in her chest. She was up before 4. She dressed in the dark and took the market basket and went out the back door, sliding the bolt behind her as quietly as she could. The night was cool and very still. The stars were still out. She found the path by feel more than sight. She'd walked it enough times that her feet knew the grade, and she moved through the dark in the direction of the Henderson farm. It was 3 miles. She walked fast. The Henderson boy, 16 and serious in the way of oldest children who'd had to be, was already up when she arrived, feeding the horses before the rest of the family stirred. She gave him the catalog and told him what was inside it and what the mail stop at Ryder's Crossing was and who it needed to go to in Calverton, and she paid him twice what it was worth because she needed it done right and because she needed him not to mention it in town. He looked at her face in the early light with the directness of a young person who hadn't learned yet to look away from difficult things. "You all right, Mrs. Ashcroft?" he said. "Working on it," she said. "Get it there fast." She walked back in the growing gray of early morning and slid in through the back door and had the coffee on before Rufus came down. He looked at her across the kitchen. She looked back. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Coffee's ready." He sat down. She poured him a cup. He drank it looking at the wall, and she moved around the kitchen doing the morning work. And neither of them said anything else, and she thought, 35 days was what we had, and now we have less. And whatever comes next, I am not the same woman I was when this started, and that has to mean something. Gideon came at 6:30, as he'd said he would. She told him about the Henderson boy at the crossing, and he nodded. "Good," he said. "I sent a letter last night through the Beckett Ranch. Their foreman rides to Calverton on Tuesdays. It should get there ahead of yours, or right behind it." "What did you send?" "Everything I have from Marston Creek, and a formal request to move up the circuit date if there's any flexibility in the schedule." He looked at her. "There probably isn't, but I had to ask." He bought some salt and a length of cord and left in 15 minutes. Chet Varley was leaning against the wall outside the hardware store across the street when Gideon came out, not quite watching, but arranged so he could watch. Mabel saw it through the window. She watched Gideon cross the street and noted that he walked in a straight line to the livery without varying his pace, without looking at Varley, without doing anything that acknowledged him. Varley's eyes followed and then went still. The days after that were the hardest kind, full of waiting and ordinary work, with something building underneath that she couldn't see and couldn't address directly. She ran the post. She kept the books. She noted everything Varley did in the documentation because Varley had begun watching the post more openly now, standing across the street in the mornings when Gideon came in, sometimes following at a distance when she went to collect eggs from behind the post. Rufus had started eating dinner at home again, which he hadn't done consistently in months. He sat at the table and watched her move around the kitchen with a quality of attention that was new. Not the hot attention that preceded the worst of it, but something colder and more deliberate, as if he were solving for something. He asked about the deed on a Thursday, the way he asked about it sometimes, casual and sideways. "You ever think about simplifying the arrangement with Foss?" he said. "Seems like a long way to go every time something needs signing." She set the pot on the table. "Nothing needs signing," she said. "The arrangement is fine. I just think it'd be more convenient." "Rufus." She sat down. She met his eyes. "The arrangement with Foss was what my father set up before he died, and I'm not changing it." Her father had not set it up. She had. But she had learned that invoking her father, who Rufus had never met but could not easily argue with, was useful. Rufus looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his plate. He picked up his fork. "Fine," he said. The following Monday, Gideon came in at 6:30 and bought nothing. He stood at the counter and told her in a low voice that he had heard something through a man at the livery, one of the Beckett hands who talked too much when he drank, that Rufus and Harlan Dodd and Chet Varley had been in the back room at the saloon for 2 hours the previous night. She listened. She kept her hands flat on the counter. "The hand said he didn't hear much," Gideon said. "But he heard Harlan say your name, and he heard Varley say river." River. She thought about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, 2 miles out from the post. The low ground there, the cottonwoods, the place where sound didn't carry because of the way the land folded. "They're planning something at the river," she said. "Or talking about it." He kept his voice even. "I don't know when or exactly what, but yes." She looked at him. "They're planning it for you." He didn't deny it. She pressed her palms harder against the counter. There was a feeling moving through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was something more like the moment before a decision, when everything becomes very clear and the noise drops out and you can see exactly what is in front of you. "I'm not going to let them hurt you," she said. "Mabel, I mean it." Her voice was quiet. It didn't shake. "You came here and you stayed, and you did not walk past it. I'm not going to sit behind a locked door while they—" She stopped. She breathed. "I need you to tell me everything you know, and I need you to stop leaving things out, because you think it'll worry me." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He told her. Not everything maybe, but more than he had been telling her. That Varley was known to have worked in this kind of arrangement before. That his particular skill was making things look like accidents, or like a man had ridden out of town on his own. That Harlan Dodd had done this twice before in towns to the west where he'd held similar positions, and there were 2 men who'd died without investigation. He told her that he had written to a contact at the federal marshal's office in the territorial capital and had not yet received an answer, and that the circuit judge was the stronger play, but the timing was the problem, and that the problem was he did not know how much time they had. She listened to all of it. "I need a gun," she said when he finished. He was quiet. "I have one," she said. "My father's. It's in the lockbox with the deed in Calverton. That's 40 miles away, I know." She looked at the shelf behind her. "I need another one, something I can keep here in the post, under the counter." He thought about it. "I'll bring you one tomorrow morning," he said. "A small one, easier to keep close. And you need to teach me to use it properly." "I know how to shoot," she said quickly. "I know you know how to shoot. I need to know how you handle it when your hands are shaking." He said it without condescension, just fact, the way he said everything. "That's a different skill." She considered that. "Fine," she said. "There's a field north of the Henderson farm. I'll be there Wednesday morning, 5 o'clock. Can you get there without being seen?" "I can get anywhere without being seen," she said. "I've been moving around this property in the dark for 3 years. He didn't say anything to that. He just looked at her with that steady, particular look, and she thought she saw something behind it. Not sentiment, but a kind of recognition, one person registering another person's specific weight. He left. Varley watched from across the street. She went back to the counter and picked up her pencil and wrote the date and the word river in the documentation book. Wednesday morning, she was at the field north of the Henderson farm at 10 to 5, in the dark and the cool, with her coat buttoned and her hair pinned up and her heartbeat running about 20 points higher than usual. Gideon was already there. He had set up 3 tin cans on a fence post, and there was enough pre-dawn light to see them dimly. He handed her the gun, small, well-kept, a short-barreled revolver that fit her palm better than she expected. She shot the first can on the 3rd try. She shot the second on the first. She missed the third 6 times in a row, and then stepped forward without saying anything and shot it from half the distance. Gideon watched. "You rush it," he said. "I know." "Don't rush it. You have more time than you think, even when you think you don't." She reloaded. She shot the first replacement can on the first try. "There," he said. They stayed until the light got too good and the farm would be waking. She put the gun in the market basket under a cloth and walked back to the post in the early morning. The town was just beginning to stir. Smoke coming from the bakery, the smith's hammer starting up. Delworth waking into another ordinary day that did not know it was not ordinary. She tucked the revolver under the counter, behind the row of tobacco tins, loaded. She opened the post at 7, served customers, wrote in the accounts, made coffee. 2 days later, on a Friday, a letter came from Calverton. Not from Merritt Foss, but from someone she didn't know, a name she had to read twice, a woman named Grace Ellerman. The letter was short and had been written in a hurry, the handwriting slanting with urgency. She had to read it 4 times before she fully absorbed what it said. Grace Ellerman was the woman from Marston Creek. Somehow Merritt Foss had written to her, or the man Gideon knew had, and she had written back. And now here was this letter in Mabel's hands from a woman 2 territories away who had survived the same man under a different name. Grace Ellerman had kept records too. She had kept them for 2 years in a box under her kitchen floor, and she had sent copies to a contact in Calverton who had passed them to a man who had passed them to Merritt Foss. She wanted Mabel to know. She wanted Mabel to know that she wasn't the only one, and that the paperwork existed and that she was willing to make a formal statement. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller handwriting, as if added after the main letter was sealed and then unsealed again, "I believed for a long time that no one would ever believe me. I understand if you feel the same way. But there are 2 of us now. That changes what is possible." Mabel set the letter down on the counter. She stared at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the letter and put it under the floorboard with everything else. She was still thinking about Grace Ellerman that evening when the storm began to come in from the west. Low, dark clouds moving fast, the temperature dropping the way it did out here when the weather meant business. She closed the shutters on the west side of the post and went into the house and started a fire and made something for dinner. Rufus came home at 8, later than usual, smelling like whiskey and something else. Something sharper and less simple than whiskey. He didn't speak when he came in. He sat at the table and looked at the fire for a while, and Mabel moved around the kitchen with the particular economy of motion she used when she could feel the pressure building. No unnecessary gestures, no sounds that could be misinterpreted. He went to bed at 9. She sat in the kitchen. The storm hit harder around 10, the kind of storm this territory produced sometimes in the tail end of summer. Hard, fast rain, the crack of lightning close enough to feel in your back teeth. The house shook once with a long roll of thunder. She was about to go to bed when she heard Rufus's voice through the wall, not talking to her, not talking in his sleep, the particular low murmur of a man talking to someone else, too quiet to make out words. She went still. She moved to the wall. She pressed her ear against the plaster. The voice on the other side of it was Rufus, and there was another voice under his, tinier and less distinct. Not a second person in the room, but the sound of a voice through a window. Someone outside. In the rain. She caught pieces. Not words at first, just rhythm and volume. Then, in a gap between the rain, tomorrow night, and then Rufus. The river, like we said. And then the other voice, which she now recognized as Varley's, clipped and professional. Wants it done before he gets the letter. You understand? Before he gets the letter. She pulled back from the wall. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and breathed. Tomorrow night. The river. Before the letter. The letter from Calverton. Either Gideon's contact had been found out, or Rufus had people watching the mail stop, or both, or something else she hadn't thought of. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that they knew something was coming through official channels, and they intended to move before it arrived. She crossed to the window. The rain was coming down hard and straight. The street was dark. No one out in this. She could see the faint light from the saloon 3 buildings down. She went to the back door. She slid the bolt. She stood with her hand on it for a full minute, thinking through what she was about to do. The livery was 6 buildings down and across the street. If Varley was at the window talking to Rufus, he was on the south side of the house. The livery was north. She could go through the garden and cut behind the barber's building and come at the livery from the back. She put on her coat. She took the revolver from under the counter, the small one Gideon had given her, and put it in her coat pocket. She put on her hat. She went out the back door into the rain. The cold hit her immediately, water already running off the brim of her hat in a steady pour. She moved through the garden and out the gap in the back fence and into the alley behind the row of buildings. The ground was slick, and the darkness was near total between the lightning flashes. She put her hand on the back wall of the barber's building and moved along it by feel. The lightning flashed. She saw the back of the livery 10 yards ahead and ran. She went in through the rear livery door and pushed it closed behind her and stood dripping in the smell of horses and hay, her breath coming fast. Brown was in the second stall from the left. He looked at her and flicked an ear. The other horses barely moved. Gideon was on his feet before she got to the stall. He'd been sleeping on the cot he kept in the corner, and she'd woken him, but he came up fast and quiet the way a man does when he's spent a long time sleeping in places where he might need to be fast. He looked at her, at the state of her, at the gun-shaped weight in her coat pocket. "Tell me," he said. She told him, precisely in order what she had heard through the wall and what she had worked out from it. She told him the timeline, tomorrow night, the river, before the letter, which meant they believed something was coming and they were working against it. He listened with his hands at his sides and his face very still. "You walked here through that," he said when she finished. He said it not in a scolding way, but in the way of a person noting something that told them something. "It's 6 buildings," she said. "In the dark, in a lightning storm, with a loaded revolver. If you're going to say something about it, say it." He looked at her for a moment. "I was going to say I'm glad you came," he said. "Sit down. You're soaked through." She sat on the edge of the cot. He found a piece of sacking that was cleaner than the others and handed it to her, and she pressed it to her face. The rain hammered the roof. Brown shuffled in his stall. "Tomorrow night," Gideon said. He was thinking out loud, low and methodical. "They think I'll go to the river because—" He stopped. "I have been going to the river. In the mornings, early, to think." He looked at the floor. "Varley's been watching closer than I thought." "They're going to set it up so you walk into it," she said. "Or they'll create a reason, some message that makes me think I need to go there." His jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter. I won't go." "Gideon," she looked at him. "If you don't go, they'll do something else. Something we can't see coming. At least at the river we know." He looked at her. She watched him understand what she was saying. She watched him not like it. "You're saying let it happen," he said. "I'm saying be ready for it," she said. "If you stay away from the river, they replan. They find a different angle, a different night, and we lose what we know. But if you go, and I go with you—" "No," he said, flat and immediate. "I can shoot," she said. "You saw me on Wednesday. I saw you shoot tin cans in a field at 5 in the morning. That's not the same. I know it's not the same." She held his eyes. "I know exactly what it is. I also know that Rufus is going to be at that river tomorrow night because he has 3 years of wanting to be there, and he is not going to send other men to do what he personally wants to do." She paused. "And I need to be there. Not for you, for me. For what happens after. The statements, the federal marshals, the circuit judge. I need to have been there." He was quiet for a long time. The rain was starting to ease slightly, still heavy, but not the drowning weight of an hour ago. "You'd stay back," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "Far enough back that I'm not in it. Close enough that I'm a witness. She paused. And close enough to matter if something goes wrong. Another silence. He sat down on a bale of hay across from her. He put his hands between his knees and looked at them for a moment. I need you to promise me something, he said. Depends what it is. He looked up. If something goes wrong and I tell you to run, you run. You don't stop and you don't look back. You get to the Henderson farm and you tell the boy to ride for Calverton and you wait. His eyes held hers. Promise me that. She looked at him. Mabel. His voice had gone lower, and something in it had lost the practiced steadiness. Just for a moment, just enough to let her see what was underneath. Promise me. I promise I'll run if you tell me to, she said. But I need you to promise me something too. He waited. Promise me you don't do anything that gets you killed because you're trying to protect me. She said it evenly. You came here because of your sister. I know that. And I know what you carry about it. But I'm not your sister, and I'm not going to be the reason you stop being careful. The silence between them had a different texture now. Not the comfortable working silence of the post, and not the tense silence of a situation being managed. Something more personal. Something that had been building in the daily increments of 6:30 mornings and coffee and ledger figures and tin cans in a field and a letter from a woman 2 territories away. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. She stood up. She handed him back the piece of sacking. I need to get back before he wakes up and finds me gone. He stood too. He was close, and she was aware of it in the specific way she had become aware of his proximity over the past weeks. Not uncomfortable, not unwanted, just present in a way she hadn't let herself examine too directly. Go the same way you came, he said, the alley behind the barber's. I know the way, she said. She moved toward the rear door. She put her hand on the latch. Mabel. She looked back. He was standing in the middle of the livery with the lamp behind him and the rain easing on the roof and the horses quiet in their stalls, and he said it simply, without arrangement. I'm glad you came 3 years ago and kept this place running instead of letting it fall apart. She looked at him. That's a strange thing to say, she said. It's what I mean, he said. I mean it exactly. She went out into the rain. The alley was dark and the ground was slick, and she moved through it fast, her hand on the back wall, the revolver heavy and solid in her coat pocket. She went through the gap in the back fence, and through the garden and through the back door and slid the bolt behind her. She stood in the dark kitchen with her wet coat and the sound of the rain on the roof and the sound of Rufus's breathing through the wall, the same sound he'd been making all night, unchanged. She hung up her coat. She sat down at the table. She put her hand flat on the wood. Tomorrow night. She sat there a while in the dark, not moving, just breathing. Then she went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about Grace Ellerman, 2 territories away, writing, I believed for a long time that no one would ever believe me in small handwriting at the bottom of a letter. She thought about the river and the cottonwoods and the sound of the water over the stones at the low bend where the banks came together. She thought about Gideon standing in the livery with the lamp behind him, saying what he meant exactly. She thought about her father's voice. Mabel, girl, come look at these figures. See how they balance. Everything she had built and kept and recorded and carried. She was not afraid. That surprised her. She examined it, turning it over, checking it for the kind of false courage that was just fear wearing a different name. But it wasn't false. She was not afraid. She was something else. Alert, clear-eyed, holding all the pieces of what she knew in a sequence that made sense. Tomorrow night, she would be there. She closed her eyes. She woke before the alarm she'd set in her head, a skill that came from years of needing to be up and moving before Rufus, of calibrating her body to the dark the way a farmer calibrated it to seasons. It was the morning after the storm, and the world outside was washed clean and very quiet in the way things were quiet after a hard rain, as if the violence of the night before had used up all the available noise. She lay still for a moment and listened to the house. Rufus's breathing through the wall, the same untroubled rhythm it always was in the early hours. The creak of the roof settling, nothing else. She got up. She went through the day the way she went through every day, opened the post, served customers, wrote the accounts. She made no changes to her routine that anyone watching would notice. She swept the front step. She ordered salt pork from the supply rider. She gave Clement Price his usual patient attention while he looked at the same 3 items and bought none of them. Gideon came at 6:30 and bought dried beans and said 4 words to her while she bagged them. Tonight, South Bank, 9. She nodded. He left. Varley watched from across the street and then looked away. She noted the time in the documentation book. Then she closed it and put it back. Rufus was different that day. Not agitated. The opposite. He was calm in a way she'd seen only a few times before, a smooth, careful calm that meant he'd made a decision and settled into it. He ate breakfast without complaint. He told her the east fence needed checking, which was the first piece of ranch business he'd mentioned in 6 weeks, and she said she'd look at it. He nodded and went out. He came home for dinner. He ate everything on the plate. He didn't ask about Gideon and didn't ask about Foss and Calverton and didn't do the sideways thing with the deed. He was pleasant in a way that made her skin feel tight. After dinner, he said he had something to attend to. He put on his coat. He left. She watched the door after it closed. She counted to 60. Then she went to the back room and pulled up the floorboard and took out the documentation book and the letter from Grace Ellerman and the small cash tin. And she wrapped them all in an oilcloth and tied it with cord and put the package in the market basket. She put the revolver in her coat pocket. She put on her coat and her hat. She went out through the back door. The night was cool and smelled like wet earth, and the sky was clear in the way it got clear after a storm, every star sharp and close. She crossed the garden and went through the gap in the fence and took the alley north, then cut east toward the river road. She kept to the edge of the road where the grass softened her steps. She moved fast. Not running. Running attracted attention and wore you out before you needed the energy, but fast, head down, covering ground. The river was 2 miles out. The land flattened as she got closer, the scrub giving way to cottonwoods, the air picking up the smell of moving water. She could hear it before she could see it, the low, steady sound of the creek running full after the rain, louder than usual, running over its banks a little in the low spots. She found the south bank where the cottonwoods were thickest. The land here was a series of shallow ridges above the floodplain, and she climbed to the second ridge and settled into the shadow of a large cottonwood and looked down toward the water. She was early. The river moved below her in the dark, pale and quick. She waited. Gideon arrived first. She saw him come in from the west along the bank, walking his horse, which he tied to a cottonwood at the water's edge. He took a position near a large rock, his back to it, facing the direction the others would come from. He'd seen her, she thought. His head turned toward the ridge for a moment, just a moment, then back. 3 minutes later, they came. Harlan Dodd first, on horseback, with 2 men she didn't recognize riding behind him. Then, on foot, emerging from the tree line to the east, Rufus. And behind Rufus, Chet Varley, moving quiet and separate from the others in the way of a man who thought of himself as a different category of problem. 5-1. She put her hand on the revolver in her pocket. She did not take it out. Not yet. Harlan Dodd pulled his horse up 12 feet from Gideon and looked down at him in the way men on horseback looked at men on foot. "Cross," he said. "Glad you came out. Saves us the trouble of looking." Gideon was leaning against the rock with his arms loosely crossed. "You sent me a note," he said. "Said there was something to discuss about a warrant." He looked at Dodd steadily. "Only now that I'm here, I'm thinking there's no warrant." "There is," Dodd said. "Actually?" He shifted in the saddle. "Man with your history has warrants in more places than he knows about." "What history's that?" "The kind that gets a man shot trying to run," Dodd said. He said it plainly, as a matter of logistics rather than threat. "Save everyone some paperwork." Gideon looked at him. His face didn't change. "You're going to want to think about this very carefully, Harlan." "Don't call me Harlan. I've been corresponding with the federal marshal's office since I arrived in Delworth," Gideon said. "Letters went out through the Beckett Ranch, through the Henderson boy, through a rider in Calverton, several different channels." He paused. "I did that specifically so you couldn't intercept all of it." A silence. The river ran. "You're bluffing," Dodd said. "I'm not," Gideon said. And you know I'm not because you've been watching every piece of mail that's left this town for 3 weeks, and you've been nervous because you know you haven't caught all of it. From where she was on the ridge, Mabel could see Rufus's face. She watched it do something, a shift, almost invisible, the calculation of a man whose timeline was suddenly in question. Dodd looked back at the two riders. Some signal she couldn't see. The riders moved apart slightly, separating their angles. "Doesn't matter," Dodd said. He put his hand on his holster. "Letters take time. We're here now." "Sheriff," Gideon's voice hadn't changed pitch or speed. "Before you do whatever you're about to do, I want you to look at the ridge above the south bank." Dodd looked. She was in the shadow of the cottonwood, and she didn't move. She held still and kept her breathing slow. Dodd looked for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at Gideon. "I don't see anything." "You wouldn't," Gideon said. "She's been keeping accounts her whole life. She's good at staying in the margins." Another silence, longer this time. She saw Rufus take 2 steps forward and stop. His voice came across the water low and tight. "She's not here. She's at the house." "She left the house 40 minutes ago," Gideon said. "She went out the back." She's had the whole conversation documented in a book that's already been copied and sent 3 different directions. If something happens to me tonight, the copies land on the federal judge's desk with an account of this exact meeting. It was a partial bluff. The book was real. The copies were not. There hadn't been time. But Rufus didn't know that, and Rufus believed, as men like him often believed, that the women they'd spent years underestimating were exactly as limited as they'd been told they were. She watched Rufus believe it. She watched the belief crack. "Mabel," his voice rose, aimed at the ridge. "Come down from there." She didn't move. "Mabel, I swear—" "She can't hear threats from up there," Gideon said. "And even if she could—" Rufus turned, not to Dodd, not to Varley. He turned to the dark to the east and moved toward the tree line, and she understood what he was doing before he'd taken 4 steps. He was going around. He was going to come at the ridge from the side, come up behind her while Dodd and Varley held Gideon at the water. She moved. She came off the ridge fast and low, not toward Gideon but parallel to him, keeping to the cottonwoods, moving east to cut off Rufus's angle. Below her she heard the explosion of sound as the situation at the river broke apart. Dodd's voice, a shot, the crack of it enormous in the dark, then return fire. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She could hear Rufus ahead of her, crashing through the brush, and she followed the sound. The ground was soft from the rain and treacherous in the dark. She went down on one knee in a low spot, came back up, kept moving. The cottonwoods thinned. She broke into a narrow clearing and stopped. Rufus was 10 feet away. He'd been moving fast and she'd cut his angle, and they came into the clearing from different sides and stopped, both of them breathing hard, both of them in the thin starlight that made it through the canopy. He looked at her. She had the revolver out. He looked at the gun, then at her face. And something happened in his expression that she had not seen in 3 years. Something that was not calculation and not performance. Something real. "Mabel," he said, different this time, quieter. "Don't," she said. "Put that down." He took a step toward her. "Don't take another step." He took another step. She held the gun level and kept her breath even the way Gideon had told her. "You have more time than you think, even when you think you don't." She thought about tin cans in a field at 5 in the morning. She thought about 3 years of hauling grain sacks and chopping wood and keeping the books and surviving every single night in that house. "You won't shoot me," Rufus said. He took another step. "You don't have it in you." "You've been wrong about me from the beginning," she said. "You should stop doing that." He lunged. She sidestepped. Not gracefully, not with any of the neatness of a story. She stumbled back on the wet ground and went sideways, and the gun didn't fire because her finger came off the trigger when her balance went. He caught her coat, and she spun with it and used the spin to put her shoulder into him rather than fighting the momentum, the way you did when you'd spent your life moving weight rather than lifting it. She caught him off center and drove forward, and they both went down into the mud. She was heavier than he was. He'd always used that against her. The comments, the names, the years of telling her it made her worthless. Now it meant something different. She had leverage and mass and 3 years of anger that had compressed into something as dense and usable as Riverstone, and she used all of it. She pinned his arm with her knee and put her forearm across his chest and found the gun in the mud and pressed it into the ground beside his head, where he could see it and feel it. He was breathing hard. She was breathing hard. The sounds from the river were different now. The shots had stopped. She didn't know what that meant. She couldn't think about what that meant. "You think I'm nothing," she said. She was not yelling. Her voice was level and precise, and she was looking directly at him. "You've thought that since before the wedding. You thought it when you picked me specifically because you thought nothing would be easy to manage." She pressed down with her knee, felt him wince. "You were right that I was alone. You were wrong about everything else." He said something. She couldn't quite hear it. "What?" she said. "Get off me," he said. Low, grinding, the particular voice of a man who could not process what was happening in terms that made sense to him. "No," she said. A sound behind her. She went rigid. "It's me." Gideon's voice coming through the cottonwoods to the west. He came into the clearing at a run that slowed when he saw what he was looking at. He stopped. He looked at Rufus on the ground, at Mabel's knee on his arm and her forearm on his chest and the gun in the mud beside his head. He looked at her face. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Dodd?" "Down," she said. "The others?" "One ran, the other's not going anywhere." A pause. "Varley?" "I haven't seen him since I left the ridge." She felt Rufus tense under her and pressed down harder, and he made a short, ugly sound. "Stop moving," she said. To Rufus, not to Gideon. Gideon moved into the clearing and came around to Rufus's other side and crouched down. He had a length of cord. She didn't ask where it came from. He tied Rufus's wrists with the practiced ease of a man who'd done it before, and she felt the tension in Rufus's body shift from struggle into a different kind of held-back energy, the low, hot energy of humiliation, which was worse for him than physical pain. "You sit up slowly," Gideon told Rufus. "You think about your situation." Rufus sat up. The mud on his back and his sleeves was dark and heavy. He looked at Mabel. His face had gone through several things and landed somewhere she hadn't seen before, so not the calculation, not the performance, but something raw and small. She picked up the revolver. She stood. Her leg was aching where she'd gone down on it. Her coat was muddy from the shoulder. Her hands had stopped shaking at some point. She wasn't sure when. "Are you hurt?" Gideon said. To her? "No." She took stock. Knee was sore. The heel of her left hand where she'd caught herself in the mud was scraped. "You?" "Dodd grazed me." He said it like it was a minor inconvenience. She looked and saw the dark patch on his left sleeve. "How bad?" "Needs cleaning." He looked at the sleeve. "I've had worse." "I believe you," she said. "We need to get him back to town." Rufus looked up at her. "You think this is over?" he said. His voice had recovered some of its surface. Not all of it. "You think one night at a river." "I think you have a wife in Marston Creek," Mabel said. She watched his face. "Her name is Grace Ellerman. She wrote me a letter. She's been keeping records for 2 years, and she's made a formal statement to a contact in Calverton. The statement describes a man named Aldous who married a widow for her mill and her 40 acres. The surface cracked again. "I think," Mabel continued, "that when the circuit judge arrives in Calverton, which is in 3.5 weeks now, not 5, he is going to have my documentation and Grace Ellerman's documentation and a signed statement from Merritt Foss and a formal complaint from whatever's left of Harlan Dodd's credibility. I think the federal marshal's office is already aware of this situation because Gideon has been corresponding with them for a month." She put the revolver in her pocket. "And I think you're going to sit in the Delworth jail until then, because that is exactly what is about to happen." Rufus said nothing. The sound of the river filled the space between them. "Get up," Gideon said. They walked back through the cottonwoods and out onto the road. Gideon with the cord in his hand and Rufus at the end of it, and Mabel 3 steps behind, and the stars were sharp and clear overhead in the washed-out sky. Below them at the water she could hear Dodd, alive she could tell from the sound, sitting up and audible. and behind them the tree line was quiet, which meant Varley had gone when the shooting started, which was what men like Varley did. The walk back to Delworth was 2 miles, and no one spoke for most of it. She walked behind the two men and listened to the night sounds coming back into the space the storm had left behind, and thought about what Gideon had said in the livery. "I'm glad you came and kept this place running, instead of letting it fall apart." The specific plainness of it. The fact that he had meant it exactly. She thought about her father's counting house, the ledger lines that added up, the way a solid thing stayed solid when it was built right. She'd built this. Not the confrontation. That had built itself once the variables were in place. She'd built the variables, the documentation, the contacts in Calverton, the relationship with Merritt Foss, the letter that had reached Grace Ellerman, the record of every date and bruise and withdrawal from the ranch account, written small and kept safe in an oilcloth under a floorboard. She had built the thing that would bring him down before she ever knew that was what it was for. She had built it because building things was what she did, and because the alternative was giving him the last piece of her that he hadn't managed to touch. The outskirts of Delworth appeared. The Smiths building, dark, the water trough, the first line of fence, a lamp burning in the window of the bakery where someone always started early. She could see lights further down at the saloon, the usual ones. Gideon stopped at the edge of the road. "The deputy," he said. It was more of a question than anything, whether Delworth had one, whether he was trustworthy. "Pete Saller," Mabel said. "He's Dodd's deputy, and he's 23 years old, and I've sold him tobacco every week for 2 years. I don't think he knew what Dodd was." She thought about Pete Saller's face, genuinely young, not the performed youth of a man pretending. "I think he just followed what he was told." "Then Pete Saller gets a choice tonight," Gideon said. They went into town. Pete Saller was awake. He was always awake late, another thing she knew from 2 years of paying attention. And he came to the door of the jail when Gideon knocked with the particular knock of someone who intends to be let in. He opened the door and looked at Gideon, and then at Rufus, and then at Mabel, and a series of things crossed his young face in rapid succession. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Pete," she said, "we need to put my husband in a cell, and I need to explain some things to you about Harlan Dodd." He looked at Rufus, at the cord around Rufus's wrists, at the mud on everyone. "Is the sheriff—" "He's at the river. He's alive." Gideon said it before Pete's voice could finish cracking. "He's going to need a doctor before he needs anything else. After that, he's going to need to be in the cell next to this one." Pete Saller looked at the situation for a long moment. He stepped back and opened the door all the way. They put Rufus in the second cell. He didn't fight it, not because the fight had gone out of him entirely, but because Rufus Hale had always known when a calculation had moved against him, and this one had moved too far to recover tonight. He sat on the cot and looked at the wall. She looked at him through the bars for a moment, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction she might have imagined feeling once, just looked, the way you look at a thing you are finally done carrying. Then she turned away. Pete Saller rode out to the river with the doctor and brought Harlan Dodd back on a horse. She heard it from the front room of the jail where she and Gideon were sitting across from each other at Pete's desk. Dodd had been shot in the side, not fatally, and he came in leaning hard on Pete and didn't look at her when they went past. She looked at him anyway. Doc Morrow came out from the back room an hour later and said Dodd would live and needed rest, and asked no questions about how any of this had happened, which told her that Doc Morrow had known more than he'd ever said and was making calculations of his own. Gideon's arm needed cleaning and 2 stitches, and he sat still for both of them with the particular stolid patience of a man accustomed to this kind of maintenance. She sat beside him and handed the doctor what he asked for, and did not fuss, because fussing was not what either of them needed. When it was done, she and Gideon sat back at Pete's desk, and she laid out the documentation, the book from the oilcloth, the letter from Grace Ellerman, the notes on Dodd's 2 visits to the post. And she walked Pete Saller through it the way she walked through accounts, methodically and in order. Pete listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them reasonable. He took notes in the margin of a piece of paper in handwriting that was careful and slightly too large, the way young people wrote when they were trying to be precise. "I didn't know about Marston Creek," Pete said. He said it in the voice of a man who was deciding something about himself. "I swear I didn't know about that." "I believe you," she said. She did. "What do you need me to do?" "Send a wire to the federal marshal's office in the territorial capital tonight," Gideon said. "Tell them you have Rufus Hale in custody on charges related to an assault, a conspiracy to commit murder, and a land fraud case that connects to an open matter in Marston Creek. Give them the names. They'll know what to do." Pete wrote it down. "And keep both of them in those cells," Mabel said. "Whatever Rufus tells you tomorrow morning, whatever Dodd says when the doctor's done with him, they stay there." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. She looked at him. 23 years old, he was going to have a difficult week. "Pete," he looked up. "You're doing the right thing," she said. She said it simply because it was true and because he needed to hear it from someone and there was nobody else at hand. He nodded. His jaw was set in the way of young people trying to hold a difficult thing steady. She and Gideon stepped out of the jail into the early morning dark. It was past 2. The town was fully quiet now, the saloon lamp gone out, the street empty. The stars were starting the subtle shift they made in the last hours before dawn, moving toward the west. She stood on the step. The market basket with the oilcloth was in her hand. She was still muddy, and her knee ached, and she needed to sleep. And underneath the tiredness, there was something she couldn't name immediately. A feeling of a particular weight having been set down after so long, she'd forgotten it was there, that the absence of it was almost disorienting. "You should get the wound looked at again in the morning," she said. "I will," he said. "And you should eat something. You never eat enough." He looked at her sideways. "You've noticed that." "I notice things," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, which was as far as Gideon Cross generally went in that direction, and she had come to value it at the full weight of a full smile from anyone else. "What happens now?" he said. "Not about tonight. About after." "I go home and sleep," she said. "Tomorrow I open the post at 7. I send a letter to Merritt Foss in Calverton telling him what's happened and asking him to expedite what he can before the circuit date." She looked at the street. "And I wait for the federal marshal's office to send someone, which they will, now that Pete's sent the wire." "And the ranch?" "The ranch is mine," she said, simply, as fact. "It's always been mine. It was never anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "I might stay on a while," he said. He said it carefully, the way he said things he'd been thinking about for a while. "There's some land north of the Henderson farm that looks like it might be worth something. Man at the livery says the owner's been thinking about selling." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying and what he was not saying and what both of those things meant. "Delworth's not a large town," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. It's going to have a difficult couple of months while the court business gets sorted." "Things worth having usually require some difficult months," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the dark. The basket was in her hand. Her coat was muddy. She was very tired and very awake at the same time. "The land north of Henderson's is good land," she said, "if the price is fair." "I thought so too." She stepped off the step. "Good night, Gideon." "Good night, Mabel." She walked home. The back way, through the alley, through the garden. She went in through the back door and slid the bolt. The iron bolt he'd put on the frame 6 weeks ago that caught every time without fail. She hung up her coat. She set down the basket. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and put her hands flat on the wood and felt the solid fact of it. The table her father had built, the house her father had built, the land that had always been hers, the records she had kept that had turned out to matter more than anything a gun could do. She sat there until the first gray started in the window. Then she got up and put on the coffee. The coffee was ready before the sun came up, and she drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that came just before gray, the color of something deciding what it was going to be. She was tired in a way that went past the body, the kind of tired that had been accumulating for 3 years and had finally, last night, found a place to land. She felt it in her shoulders and behind her eyes, and in the slow, deliberate way her thoughts were moving, like water after a dam breaks. Not fast and violent anymore, but spreading wide and quiet into new ground. She poured a second cup. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel something larger, something with more shape to it, anger resolved, or relief, or some version of satisfaction that matched the size of what had happened. What she felt instead was quieter and harder to name. Like the feeling after a long piece of hard physical work, when the work is done and your hands are still, and you realize you have been so concentrated on the doing of it that you forgot to think about what the end would feel like. She finished the coffee. She washed the cup. She opened the Post at 7. The town found out the way towns found out things. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in pieces that spread from person to person and gathered weight as they went. Pete Saller had sent the wire the previous night. Doc Morrow had gone home and apparently said something to his wife, who said something to the baker, and by 8 in the morning, the baker's wife had told 3 people, and those 3 people had told others. By 10, there were 4 separate versions of what had happened at the river circulating through Delworth, and Mabel could track them by the faces of the people who came into the Post, the ones who'd heard the version where Gideon had shot Dodd, the ones who'd heard Dodd had shot himself accidentally, the ones who'd heard something improbable about Chet Varley and a horse. She served customers. She kept the accounts. She said very little. Clement Price came in at his usual time and looked at the 3 items he always looked at, and then he put his hands on the counter and looked at her. "Heard some things this morning," he said. "I imagine," she said. He nodded slowly. He was 70 if he was a day, and had been in Delworth longer than almost anyone, and had said approximately 400 words to her in 2 years of weekly visits. "Your daddy built this place right," he said. "He'd be glad to know it's still standing." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Clement." He picked up a tin of tobacco, the first thing she had ever seen him actually purchase, put coins on the counter, and left. She stared at the coins for a moment. Then she put them in the register. The federal marshal arrived 4 days later. Not the full weight of the office. Just one man, a deputy marshal named Aldridge, compact and methodical, and not given to wasted movement. He came into the Post first, which told her someone had briefed him on who to talk to, and he sat across the counter from her for 2 hours while she laid out the documentation in order, and he read it with the focused attention of a man who did this for a living. He asked better questions than anyone had asked her in 3 years. Specific questions, precise questions, questions that told her he already understood the basic architecture of what had happened and was checking her account against it. When she finished, he closed the documentation book and put his hands flat on the counter. "Mrs. Hale, Ashcroft," she said. "Mabel Ashcroft." He looked at her. "Mrs. Ashcroft." He nodded once. "The account from Marston Creek corroborates yours on every point it can reach. The Marston Creek matter was already under investigation before Mr. Cross contacted us. We had the name Aldous and a description. The name Rufus Hale was new, but the description was not." She felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise. More like confirmation of something she'd known but hadn't been able to prove. "How many were there?" she said. Aldridge paused. "We have documented cases in 2 territories. Marston Creek is 1. You are a 2nd. He said it carefully. "There may be others we haven't connected yet." She sat with that for a moment. "He was very good at it," she said. Not in defense of him, just as a fact, the way she stated facts. He was patient. He spent 4 months being kind before he proposed. He did his research. He picked women who were alone, who had something worth taking, who wouldn't be believed if they said anything. "Yes," Aldridge said, "that's the pattern." "He picked me specifically," she said, "because he thought I'd be easier to manage than someone else might be." She looked at the counter. "Because of my size. Because I was alone. Because he thought those 2 things together meant I'd given up." Aldridge said nothing. He waited. "He was wrong about the giving up," she said. "Clearly," Aldridge said. He stayed in Delworth 6 days. He interviewed Pete Saller and Doc Morrow and 4 other residents whose names Mabel gave him. He interviewed Gideon for the better part of an afternoon. He went to the jail twice, and she heard from Pete afterward that the first interview with Rufus had been short and the second had been shorter. On his last day, he came back to the Post and bought a bag of dried apricots and told her the matter would go before the circuit judge in Calverton, and that she would need to appear and give testimony, and that she should bring all original documentation. Will it be enough? She asked. He looked at her directly. Between your records, Mrs. Ellerman's statement, the evidence of conspiracy against Mr. Cross, and what we have from the prior investigation, yes, he said. It will be enough. After he left, she stood at the counter for a long while. She thought about Grace Ellerman, 2 territories away, writing the last line of her letter in small, careful handwriting. There are 2 of us now. That changes what is possible. It had changed what was possible. A single voice in a town where the sheriff drank with your husband and the doctor kept his mouth shut. That voice disappeared into the air and left nothing behind. 2 voices with documentation reaching a federal marshal's office through multiple channels. That was a different thing entirely. That was a paper trail. That was a record. That was the kind of thing that stayed. Mabel had understood this in her way when she started writing things down. She hadn't known exactly what she was building toward. She'd just known that writing things down was the opposite of pretending they hadn't happened. And pretending they hadn't happened was what everyone around her had been asking her to do for 3 years. She picked up the pencil. She went back to the accounts. The weeks before the circuit date in Calverton were the most ordinary weeks she had experienced in 3 years, and that ordinariness was its own kind of strange. The post ran, the accounts balanced, the ranch hands, who had known more than they'd ever said she understood now, in the way employees knew things and kept quiet, because keeping quiet was what kept them employed, began to ask her things directly instead of routing everything through Rufus. She answered their questions. She made the decisions about the east fence and the water situation and which cattle to move before the cold came. It turned out she had been making those decisions for 3 years anyway. The difference now was that no one put them in front of Rufus first. Gideon rode out to the Henderson farm on a Tuesday and came back and told her the land north of it was available and the price was better than fair. He asked her opinion on it, not whether he should buy it, not for her permission, but her actual opinion on the land itself, the grade and the water access and the soil. She told him what she knew, which was a considerable amount because she had ridden every acre within 5 miles of the post at one point or another over the past 3 years, and she kept what she observed the same way she kept everything, carefully, in order, available when needed. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions. He bought the land. He began building on it. Not fast. He didn't do things fast, but steadily, the way he did everything, each piece of it done properly before the next piece started. She could see the framing going up from the ridge east of the post on clear days, the skeleton of something that was going to be solid when it was finished. He still came to the post most mornings. Not every morning, not with the deliberate frequency of the early weeks when he'd been manufacturing reasons. Now it was natural, the way neighbors fell into proximity, the way proximity became habit, and habit became the texture of ordinary days. He bought what he needed. He drank the coffee. He told her things about the land, and she told him things about the territory, and they talked about practical matters and sometimes other things, and the talking had the quality of 2 people who'd been through something together and come out the other side knowing more about each other than most people learned in years. She didn't rush it. She didn't have the language for what it was yet, and she wasn't sure she needed the language right away. She had spent 3 years married to a man who'd made her feel like something used up and discarded, and she understood now that the undoing of that was not quick and was not linear and could not be managed on a schedule. Some mornings she woke up and felt the weight of the 3 years like a hand pressing on her chest. Some mornings she woke up and felt only the morning, the light, the coffee, the work ahead, clean and available. Both kinds of mornings were hers. That was the thing. They were hers. The day she rode to Calverton for the circuit court was a cool October morning with the smell of the first real cold coming down from the north. She dressed in the best clothes she had. Not a dress she'd worn under Rufus, nothing from those 3 years, but a jacket and skirt she'd sewn in the 2 weeks before from good dark wool she'd ordered in from a supplier she'd been dealing with for years. She pinned her hair up. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back was not the face from 3 years ago, and was not the face from 6 months ago, when Gideon had first walked through the door. There were lines she hadn't had before. Her eyes were different. Not harder exactly, but less surprised. As if they'd been rearranged to take in more of what was actually there. She put on her hat and went out to the horse and rode to Calverton. Merritt Foss met her outside the courthouse. He was a small, precise man who had been her father's lawyer before he was hers, and he shook her hand with both of his and said he was glad to see her and meant it. "It's a solid case," he said. "The federal involvement helps considerably. And Mrs. Ellerman's statement," he shook his head slightly, "the detail in it. The woman kept records that would make a banker weep." "We had the same teacher," Mabel said. She meant it figuratively. She had never met Grace Ellerman, but she understood now that the same circumstances had produced the same response in both of them, which said something about the circumstances and something about the kind of women who survived them. The hearing took most of the day. She testified for 2 hours. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, in order, without embellishment, and without minimizing. She handed the original documentation to the clerk when it was requested and watched the circuit judge, a heavy-set man named Calloway, who had been on the bench for 20 years, read through it with the same focused attention Aldridge had shown. Rufus was there, on the other side of the room, with a lawyer from somewhere Mabel didn't know. He looked at her twice during her testimony, and she looked back both times and held it until he looked away. His lawyer made arguments. The arguments were not weak. The lawyer was competent and had clearly been given time to prepare. But they ran against the weight of what was documented, and documentation, Mabel had come to understand, was the one form of testimony that did not depend on whether anyone liked you or believed you or thought a woman your size was capable of telling the truth. The record said what the record said. The dates were dates. The withdrawals from the ranch account were withdrawals. The deed had never been transferred because the deed had never been brought to Calverton without Merritt Foss present, and Merritt Foss had been specifically and legally instructed to witness no transfer without Mabel physically in the room. She had built the trap long before she knew she was building it. Judge Calloway recessed for 40 minutes. When he came back, he read from a prepared document in a flat, careful voice, and the words entered the room and rearranged it permanently. Fraud, assault, conspiracy, the Marston Creek matter incorporated by reference, the charges against Harlan Dodd to be adjudicated separately. Rufus was remanded to territorial custody. He would not be returning to Delworth. She watched them take him out through the side door. He didn't look at her again. She had expected to feel more when that happened. Some larger resolution, some closing of a door that she would hear and feel clearly. What she felt instead was quieter, like the moment after a long noise stops, when the silence is so complete you're not sure at first whether it's the absence of sound or a new kind of sound altogether. She sat in the courtroom for a moment after the room cleared. Merritt Foss sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He understood, she thought, something of what the moment was. "The deed," she said eventually, "is yours," he said. "It was always yours. There was never a valid transfer." He paused. "I'll file the paperwork to remove his name from the ranch records this week. You'll want to come in and sign a few things, but it can wait until you're ready." "Next Tuesday," she said. He nodded. Next Tuesday. She rode back to Delworth in the late afternoon, the shadows long on the road and the air cooling as the sun went down. She rode at a comfortable pace and let her mind rest, which it hadn't done in a long time. The horse knew the road and she didn't need to direct it much. The territory moved past on both sides, the scrub, the distant line of trees, the familiar grade of land that she'd been looking at her whole life and had sometimes hated and had come to understand was simply hers, like her hands or her ability with figures or the specific way she held things she was trying not to lose. Gideon was at the post when she got back. He'd been checking on the chickens, he said, because he'd ridden past that afternoon and one of them had been making a sound he didn't like, and he'd looked and found a loose board in the pen that something had been trying to get through. She looked at the pen. He'd fixed it already. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She told him what had happened in Calverton. She told it the way she'd told him everything, in order, without drama, with all the relevant details. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it genuinely rather than reaching for the closest available answer. "Like I have a great deal of work to do," she said. "The ranch books are 3 months behind where I want them. The east fence is still not right. I need to find a second hand before winter because I let one go in August when I found out he was reporting to Rufus." She paused. "And I feel like that's fine." I feel like that's what comes next. Work. And it's mine. He looked at her. That's a good answer, he said. It's the true one, she said. She made coffee. He stayed for an hour. They talked about the fence and the winter and the land north of the Henderson farm. They talked about Grace Ellerman, who had written a second letter that arrived the week before, shorter than the first, just saying that she had heard from Calverton and that she was glad. Mabel had written back. She thought they would keep writing. She thought that was something. Not a friendship yet, not with enough words between them, but the beginning of two women who had survived the same thing and were building whatever came after. When Gideon left, she stood in the doorway of the post and watched him cross the street to where Brown was tied. He mounted easily and turned the horse north and lifted one hand without looking back, which was how he said goodbye when there was nothing specific to say. She went inside. She sat at the counter and opened the accounts. She worked for 2 hours. The numbers were orderly. They behaved the way numbers behaved when they were kept properly. They told the truth and nothing but the truth. And when they balanced all the way, and there was something in that that had always steadied her, even when nothing else would. The post was quiet around her. The lamp made a small circle of light on the ledger. Outside, Delworth settled into its evening sounds. The distant noise from the saloon, a dog down the south road, the particular silence of a town that had had a difficult autumn and was recalibrating. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover. People would say, in the months and years after, that Mabel Ashcroft was lucky, that the right man had come along at the right time, that the federal marshal had arrived, and the circuit judge had been honest and things had worked out. They would say this because it was easier and because people generally preferred a story where something external arrived and changed a situation, rather than a story where a woman had spent 3 years in silence building every tool that would eventually dismantle the thing trapping her. But she knew what had actually happened. And the people closest to her knew. And the people who had been watching the documentation move through Calverton in multiple channels knew. And Grace Ellerman, 2 territories away with her own records and her own survival, knew. A man with good instincts had walked through the door and seen what most people were choosing not to see. That had mattered. She would not pretend it hadn't mattered, because pretending things hadn't mattered was how you ended up with a distorted account of reality. And she had spent enough of her life in someone else's distorted account. But what had mattered equally, what had in fact made the difference between a man with good instincts who arrived and left, and one who arrived and could actually do something, was what she had already built. The deed in Calverton, the documentation under the floorboard, the relationships with Foss and the Henderson boy and the Beckett ranch foreman who carried letters, the accounts that were kept so precisely that not a dollar had moved without record. The knowledge of every acre she'd been told was someone else's property. You could not rescue a person who had taken their situation apart and rebuilt it with the exit built in. What you could do was show up at the right moment and help them use what they'd made. She understood this not as a lesson she had learned, but as a thing she had lived, which was different. Lessons learned could be forgotten. Things lived became part of the structure of you. She got up. She turned off the lamp. She went to the back door and put her hand on the iron bolt, still solid, still catching the way it had from the first day, and slid it across. She stood in the dark for a moment. She thought about her father at the same counter, teaching her to make the figures balance. She thought about Grace Ellerman's handwriting at the bottom of a letter, small and slanting with urgency. She thought about Gideon fixing the window latch and saying, "I'm not going to do it again," about tin cans in a field at 5 in the morning, about mud and lightning and the sound of the river running full after rain. She thought about the mirror above the washstand that morning, the face that had been rearranged to take in more of what was actually there. There was a thing she had come to understand over these months that she could not have told you clearly at the start of them. It was not a simple thing. It did not fit into a single sentence. But it went something like this. Surviving was not the same as living. Surviving was what you did when you had no other options. It was grim and necessary and honorable in its way, and she did not think less of herself for having done it for 3 years. You did what the situation required. You kept the lights on. You kept the books. You ate your meals. But living was the part that came after. Living was the part where the choices were actually yours again. Where the question was not, how do I get through today without making things worse? But what do I do with what I've got? And who do I want to be? And what do I want to build here? She was in that part now. She was at the beginning of it, which meant she couldn't see very far ahead, which was uncomfortable and real and entirely different from the terrible clarity of a situation with no good options. She was glad of the discomfort. It meant there were options. She went to bed. The next morning, she woke before the alarm in her head, which was usual, and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn, which was usual, and listened to the house. The sounds were different now. Just the house, just the roof and the wind and the ambient quiet of a building that knew it was hers and had always been hers. She lay there and breathed. She got up. She made coffee. She opened the Post at 7. At 6:30, the time he had settled into without anyone formally deciding it, she heard Gideon's horse on the road. She poured a second cup and set it on the counter. He came through the door and pulled off his hat and looked at the cup and then at her. "Thank you," he said. "You need a coffee cup of your own," she said. "You've been using mine for 3 months." "I like yours," he said. "It's a tin cup from the supply shelf," she said. "It costs 14 cents. You can afford your own." He picked it up. "But then I'd have to carry it," he said, and drank. She went back to the accounts. He stood at the counter and drank the coffee and looked out the window at the morning coming up over Delworth, the light finding the water trough and the front of the bakery and the roof of the jail where Pete Saller was, she knew, trying to be a different kind of lawman than the one he'd learned from. Outside the window, the town was waking up. Smoke from the bakery, the smith's hammer starting, a wagon on the south road, the ordinary sounds of a place that had survived its autumn and was moving into winter with the specific resilience of things that had been built to last. She worked the accounts. He finished the coffee. He set the cup on the counter. "East fence today?" he said. "East fence today," she said. He put on his hat. He went out. She listened to his boots on the front step. She listened to him untie Brown and mount up. She listened to the horse move away north toward the property line. She turned back to the ledger. The numbers were orderly, the ranch accounts and the post accounts, and the winter projections, all of it adding up the way it had always added up when she kept it properly. The figures told the story of a business that was sound, and a property that was hers, and a future that was open in the way futures were open when you were the one holding the pencil. She wrote the day's date at the top of the page. October 14th, clear sky, cold coming. She started the column. She had a great deal of work to do. She was glad of it.